welcome to your next Coalesce session. My name is Jason Gans, and I am the manager for developer experience here at DBT Labs, and I am so thrilled to welcome Jared and James from the Sunrun team to talk us about automating CI/CD. We all know it's very important to have CI/CD on your project and make it so that your code is working and not breaking all the time. And we also all know that it is an incredible pain when it breaks because we want to be spending our time doing models, doing analysis, talking to stakeholders, and not debugging CI/CD pipelines, which is why we're so thrilled to have Jared and James come on up and tell us about the solution that they have for having automated CI/CD.
Thanks, Jason. We're really excited to be here at Coalesce. We've heard tons of great stuff, and we hope we don't bring you down by talking about something as crazy as Sarbanes-Oxley. If anybody's dealt with that, everybody knows that it's not so much fun to deal with. But we'll take you through today's agenda. We'll give you a brief introduction to ourselves and to Sunrun, what we do and what our organization does. We'll paint a picture of how our workflow looked like prior to DBT, and then we'll talk about us getting DBT and applying it to our software development lifecycle. That's not always related to SQL and analytics, but that's how we actually deployed it, and it's been working really well for us. James will dive right in and talk about how we automated it. We'll jump in. We'll talk about a couple of continuing improvements that we have and then offer a brief conclusion. Sunrun was founded in 2007 by Ed Fenster and Lynn Jurich, and it was actually in Ed's attic that they started that company. And the HQ remains in San Francisco. To date, we have about 11,000 employees, and we'll flex at any given time with sales fluctuations to 16,000 employees. That's feet on the ground selling this all over the nation. Our annual revenue is running at about $1.6 billion, and we're publicly traded on the NASDAQ under the stock symbol RUN. And we are currently the largest residential solar company in the nation. And to date, we're running at about since 2007, Sunrun has generated over 20 billion megawatts of power. And that adds, obviously, to the effort that we're trying to create by helping with global warming, right? Yeah, so as you see there, my name is Jared Stout. I manage the data engineering group at Sunrun. I have a 15 years working with data in various degrees, applications development, all kinds of different things, data administrator, database administrator. I went to Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah. I've been with the company for 3 years, and a couple things I love to do: travel. Incidentally, our family has spent some time in Hawaii, and we've really loved that over the years. A couple thoughts that I have on DBT. It is revolutionary. From my standpoint, having worked with data for a while, the ETL tool, traditional ETL tools, everybody knows that the traditional tools, you can't really focus on one individual model and run just the model, or upstream or downstream. That's not been possible. In DBT it now is, and I love that, as well as writing dry code, so you're not repeating yourself. You can use snippets all over the place. I'll hand it over to James to have him introduce himself.
Thank you, Jared. My name is James Sorensen, and as Jared mentioned, I'm on the data engineering team at Sunrun. I've been in the IT industry for about 12 years, and specifically with Sunrun in the solar industry for 7 years. I got a Bachelor of Science degree from Newmont College of Computer Science, and when I saw DBT, the first thing that I thought was the power of macros and how you can use them to generate dynamic SQL is really powerful and it's game-changing. I also like spending time outdoors, camping, and being with my kids, biking and hiking. So together, we are creating a planet run by the sun. And that is Sunrun's mission statement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, before we found DBT, we were looking for a solution to our stack where we bring in our source data. We have about 112 sources of data in our company. And our data analysts our data engineers were transforming them in a black box that nobody really had insight into. And then we'd pass that off to the business analysts, and they'd further transform it to create their dashboards for reporting. And it was very difficult to track lineage through that process and for an analyst to understand where is data sourced from. So some of the problems that we faced was that data transparency, where everything was happening in a black box that nobody could see into. We also were challenged with data governance and having everybody agree on the definition of what KPIs we were tracking. And then building a data dictionary and documenting that model that was constantly changing. By the time you finished creating what your data dictionary was, it had already changed and was stale. And so we were looking for a solution to solve those problems. And among those other challenges with our CI/CD process, the previous system we used had the requirement of listing the specific files that were changed with each deployment, tracking their dependencies, and putting them in the correct order to run in the database so that the models would refresh with those latest updates. And that was very manual and difficult to make sure everything was done right. On top of that, we used Jenkins as our tool to do those deployments that ran the code in test and then production. And it was not a product that our department owned or our team was an admin for. And so when we had issues with it, we had to reach out to the DevOps team that owned it and coordinate with them to get problems solved. And so it was really challenging to work through some of the side cases where something would break and we'd need to get them involved to fix it. So the DBT was the solution that we found to solve a lot of those problems. And when we decided to implement it, I'll let Jared explain that.
So we wanted to open up. We wanted to make things transparent. And as you can see, that truck right there is 100% transparent. You can see its inner workings. That's kind of what DBT does, right? We build our models within DBT, but then we can spin off and see HTML documentation. The diagrams and the data dictionaries allow us, as well as the code right in there. Anyone can see from source to target where the data is going, how it's transformed, and the business rules that are applied. That allows us to add to the governance. We find that within governance and governance committee meetings, we're opening up the DBT documentation and talking about those definitions and trying to lock those down and nurture a discussion of trying to get towards a single source of truth. Incidentally, Sunrun is the exclusive EV charger provider for the Ford F-150. And as far as electrical vehicles are concerned, that they're pushing that movement forward. We feel that DBT is doing the exact same. That's a good analogy of DBT being great in their space and pushing things forward and pushing the envelope. We feel that Ford and Sunrun coming together, partnering in that respect, is doing the same.
How fast is that truck?
That truck, we actually had a
0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds.
4.4 seconds, and I can attest to that because I did have a ride in it. It's crazy. Okay, so this is that diagram that James was talking about. No longer do we have any black boxes, right? So the 112 different sources that James talked about, we still are ingesting that information. But it's not going into a black box anymore. Things are not hidden. We are open up. We're an open book for anybody in the company to dive into the DBT documentation and see how we're applying anything anywhere. The lineage is just going right through and people can see it. Similarly, our auxiliary departments, our HR group, our finance and accounting, and all of our other performance groups are using DBT as well. So we're using the same tools, we're talking about the same way, we're having the same conversation. We're all in this club together using this awesome tool to provide this one source of truth for the business. And it's worked out really well for us. So at the same time we found DBT, we also found that the jobs could be triggered by API. And so we figured that if we could add a fully automated CI/CD process using DBT, we would have a layer of reliability and consistency that we didn't have before. Whereby if you have a specific set of guidelines and steps that your automated process goes towards, that doesn't mean that someone has to do that manually. And so if we could get to that point and try and dip into different systems via API, Jira for our ticketing system and our project management system, as well as DBT launching jobs, and GitHub using a code repository, we could have this layer of reliability, consistency, but then we also hoped that we could get SOX compliance, that our compliance group would give us approval and we would cover all of our bases there. So what is SOX compliance? Here's the most exciting part of our presentation. Wow. Right? In 2002, anybody know what was happening in 2002 that caused us to need this? Enron, right? Enron was doing what? Cooking their books. So Sarbanes-Oxley, those are the individuals in Congress that actually they push this through Congress, and it's, I don't know how thick it is these days, but it's pretty detailed. What it does is it actually protects employees and shareholders from the executives of publicly traded companies. So there is some good to it, but if you fail to follow the compliance guidelines, you can be subject to pretty bad stuff. Your penalties can be very, very expensive. And so we'll get to that in just a second. But what does that mean actually to us as a BI team? Well, we're the ones that hold the keys to the data coming from the source, going through our transformations and ending up in these reports. So we absolutely have to be part of the regulation of locking this down. So everything has to be tied to a business request. There has to be a ticket somewhere identifying in project management the business request. We use Jira. That's where we have the business requests come in. Either we create the ticket or the business creates the ticket. There just needs to be a ticket. When the changes are made, the changes need to be stored in a GitHub repository or a Git type repository where you have code and version control so you can go back and see what changed. And then on top of that, you also need independent peer review, independent SOX review, and then the deployment all has to be monitored and understood so an auditor can go back and say it was approved there, or it was deployed there, it was tested there, and it actually passed successfully the test. And all of that data has to be independent and locked down so the developers and the development team cannot edit that at any point. Real fun, right? No, it's not, unless it's automated, right? So anyway, we'll get to that. Some of the penalties that you can have, you're definitely, if you fail an audit, you're going to be audited a lot more. You're going to be under the eye of Sauron, if you will, and the audits will come a lot more. Possible fines, I'll get to that in just a second. But if you find that you are guilty of cooking your books, you could personally be held civilly liable to the SEC and whoever, and pay fines in the millions of dollars. And you could face prison time. Everybody knows who this is? Ken Lay, Jeff Skilling. Ken Lay was he was sentenced to 45 years in prison, but he died shortly before he was sentenced. Jeff Skilling was sentenced to 24 years, ended up spending about 12 years in prison for what happened with that scandal. Pretty serious, right? Everybody's, I don't know about you, but if you're, how many are working for a traded company, a publicly traded company? Okay, so this is you. Potentially. Let's hope not. So if you follow our guidelines, which James will dive into, we can help you with that.
Thank you, Jared. So yeah, as Jerry alluded to, it's something that's always hanging over our heads, and we're very concerned about following the guidelines and compliance and making sure that we can pass our audits and not be investigated with a microscope and face any more serious issues. So the first time that we got these tools and decided to try to implement it, we wanted to automate as much as possible and just remove any factor of human error. And so we had a different branch for each deployment lane. The pull requests, once the initial pull request was created in the dev branch, all of the other ones were automatically generated through that pipeline with the testing happening at each phase. And what this created was a little bit of a nightmare in that the automation didn't allow for failures in the system. Like if a test passed in the test environment, but then it failed when it got to stage or production, it was very difficult to restart it and say, oh, we need to stop this and start it over again. And so we very quickly learned that overcomplicating a project is easy to do, and it's not something that you want to continue to go down that road. And so instead of continuing to overcomplicate things, we decided to break it down to only the minimal requirements of what was needed. And so we decided to keep it as simple as we could, but still automate the pieces that were necessary. So we settled on having a design that required two branches. One is a feature branch and the main branch that's running in production. Off of that, you have your unnecessary automation is no longer part of the process to just allow for that manual intervention when something doesn't happen as expected. If a build fails, it's really easy to go back and start it over again, and you don't have all of these automated pieces moving without intervention. And so the timeline of this looks like we have the developers where it starts, and they begin with the ticket getting created, they do their dev work, and then they create a pull request. Then the automation get action happens where it does some tests against the Jira ticket to make sure that the required pieces are in place at that point. The ticket then moves to a code reviewer within the team who's an independent review of somebody who looks over the code changes and making sure that what changed matches what the request was. We then have a SOX approval person who's outside of our team that signs off on the changes as well to ensure that all of those requirements have been met and that the request is being fulfilled. Then we have the deployment phase where a manually triggered process runs another get action that runs the final SOX checks on all of the requirements, runs a deployment of the code in a production environment, and then finishes up that deployment. So this is the life cycle of what the development branch looks like. We start with a fork from the main branch. It moves into the development phase where the developer implements the changes that are requested. They then trigger the pull request, or the pull request then triggers the first automated get action step, and it goes into a UAT test phase where the business can test it and the code review and SOX approval happens. And then when it's deployed, there's a second automated get action step, and then finally the code is merged and approved. So as Jared mentioned earlier, Jira is the ticketing system that we use, and so each SOX request, or each request starts with a Jira ticket being created. Once a ticket is created, a developer is assigned to that ticket. In this case, Jared is going to be the developer for this little test case. So he can go into dbt Cloud's IDE and create a new branch for that feature request. He then makes his changes and commits the code, does his runs and makes sure that everything is successful there. And when he's ready, he creates a pull request, all within the dbt IDE. Creating that pull request triggers the dbt run that runs the code that was modified in the test environment to make sure that everything passes. And then a get action is tracking that along with the SOX checks. It's also verifying when the dbt run successfully completes, it allows or posts a comment in the Jira ticket that tells the code reviewer, who is me in this case, that the code is ready to be reviewed. And so he comes in.
All good, right?
Absolutely.
All right, cool.
Green across the board.
All right, cool.
So in Git, I go in, do a SOX approval or a code approval, as well as mark the Jira ticket that the code review is approved. Then the ticket moves into the SOX approval lane, where a SOX approver gives his stamp of approval to the ticket and moves it along for the ready to review state, where a code deployment engineer clicks the ready to review button, and that's what triggers the Git action to run in its final state of running the code in production. So it once again does a SOX check, deploys the code to production, and when that all successfully completes, it merges the branch and closes the pull request, and the branch can be deleted, the Jira ticket can be closed, and that's the end of the deployment phase. So Jared will talk about some of the improvements that we've made from the initial installation.
Before I do that, can anybody go back and can I quiz you on what step does what? Does anybody care what step does what? So that just goes to show there's so many working parts in this, right? He mentioned what actually happens, what people are doing, what's being tracked, the tests that happen. What you don't see are the notes that we put in Jira that it was actually approved. And that's an extra API step, right? And so when you look at the GitHub action, which is where all of the magic happens, it's pretty long, but it's only 2 major steps. And so if you can lock this down, if you can get inside your ticketing system, if you can get inside your testing system where you need to test your code, if you can get those people to sign off, you're good to go. We passed this through our compliance department. It took a little while for them to see exactly what was happening, but they signed off on it in the end, right? And that's gold for us, because that means that if auditors come in, we've set in place a workflow whereby there's check marks to say, hey, there's the request, here's where it was tested, here's where it was approved, here's where it was peer reviewed, and we have comments all over the place to explain where and what happened with dates and times. We're very happy with how this works. This has impacted the team almost unconsciously, because it sets up an assembly line type situation, right? So the request comes in, we have requests all day. At any one given time, we could have, if we go into our pull requests, you're going to see 12 open pull requests right now. And so this actually moves on. But what I want to say in finishing that thought is we need to be confident that things are happening and we have data tracking all of those various pieces. So while it is complex, it was tested and thoroughly vetted to make sure that it passed. So one item that also builds on what I just said is we have PR buildup, right? There's hundreds that come in every month, requests from the business. It may not be financial. A lot of them are. We didn't want to have to worry about them. They all go through this process, and so they build up. Instead of trying to deploy everything at the end of a sprint, we're trying to be agile, right? Every 2 weeks, we will deploy as we go. It'll go through UAT, and we'll deploy as we go. So we just need to make sure that we're staying on top of moving things along, making sure that those that are doing peer reviews do those peer reviews, making sure that our SOX auditor is on his toes, and who is Chandra that you saw, making sure that he signs off, or if he's not available, someone else signs off. So that's the first continuous improvement that we have. The next continuous improvement, system updates. 2 days ago, 1.3 came out. We make sure that our packages that we pull down from the marketplace are in the right version, but that caught us once, and so we need to make sure that we're on the right version before we upgrade. So that's actually in our test system right now. We're running 1.3, but during one of the presentations before, I wanted to try and get Python into people's hands, and so I made sure that all of the packages are in. We have multiple projects for our auxiliary groups, like we had explained before, but they're all on 1.3, except for our production, which we'll go through a week of review before we upgrade. So what do we get out of all of this? Peace of mind, per se. As you can tell, the alternative to this is someone would manually have to do all of these various steps if we didn't have this automated process. Management, our managers, our directors, vice president can now sleep soundly, knowing that SOX compliance is almost an afterthought. Everything is under control because of our automated process. We have reliability, consistency baked in SOX compliance.
Thank you, Jared. And like he alluded to, baked-in SOX compliance is really impactful for us because when an auditor comes in and says, I want to see the ticket that caused these requests to happen, and you have to remember 6 months or a year ago when those actual changes were in effect, it's a lot easier to do when it's all automated and you don't have to rack your brain trying to remember who made that request and where does that ticket live and what pull request was it. So it's really helped us in that regard. So we went through and explained to you after an introduction what life was like for us before we had DBT. We explained a little bit about finding and implementing DBT and what it was going to do for us, how we automated it and brought it into our deployment process, as well as some of the continuous improvements that we've made along the way. And thank you very much for coming out to our talk. And if you have any questions, we'll be monitoring the Slack channel for the next 20 minutes or so. And thank you very much.